Welcome to From X to Z, the show that believes you never age out of learning about the world around you. Featuring social media maven Danielle, Farage, and Mervyn Dinnen, the analyst who puts the X in expert. They're here to talk all things jobs, HR, and trends. So mind the generational gap. This is From X to Z, only on the Purple Acorn Network.
Welcome back to From X to Z, your favorite intergenerational podcast. I'm Danielle Farage. I'm here with my co-host, Mervyn Dinnen. Welcome back to another episode. And Mervyn, how you doing?
I'm well. I'm very well, thank you. I'm looking forward to today's chat because I think it's going to be very interesting. There's been increasing, I find, as I go to events, and obviously the time for events is beginning to ramp up now. People want to talk about this. They want to talk about the intergenerational thing. They want to this kind of attracting, retaining, engaging Gen Z is a big topic.
Yep, I'm heading to ERE very shortly to talk about this topic, and actually the topic that I'm going to be talking about is stories that attract, retain, and engage young talent. So very much on top of my mind as I prepare for that. But I think it would be a great idea to introduce the topic for this week, which came from a piece in the Standard, which you sent, I think, from the UK.
Yes.
And essentially it's this hot take, this amazing op-ed, Why My Generation Doesn't Care About Work. I love the name. I love the candor. Obviously this is something we've been talking about for probably centuries at this point of no one wants to work anymore. So it's not new, but I think that the drivers behind this sort of mentality might change just, depending on the generation. So we'll definitely get into it. I think from a high level, I think that in this article, it talks about how Gen Z views our relationship with work as more transactional than it used to be, and less about, who you are and what you do, like blacksmith or mason. It's not part of our last names anymore. Secondly, there's definitely a lot more workplace misunderstandings, as we have 5 different generations in the workplace, and the U.S. is currently seeing its most culturally diverse, generation coming into the workforce and maturing. And then the third and final observation that I saw in this article was the professionalism and productivity being redefined. Everything from dress codes to time management and how to use tools like AI to work more efficiently. Those things are all changing. Funny enough, I did a video with the Muse that came out last week or the week before. And it was about professionalism and what that looks like and what it means and how it's changed. So I love that topic. I love talking about that. So yeah, Mervyn, any initial thoughts in response to this article when you read it? How did you feel?
I felt that this is the kind of thing you and I talk about all the time. I suppose that it goes back to, I think, a previous episode for me, in that there was always a reason why we worked. It was how we got on in life. And I know that one of the shorts that people might have seen on TikTok over the last week or two was us talking about things like property prices and things, how, work was how you structured your life. As you got more experience, you earned more money, you could start a family, you could buy your own property, work was the way that I suppose you structured life and paid for life. But we've come to a point where the global economy, well, certainly the economy in the West, doesn't work like that anymore. And it's kind of work isn't how you're going to structure your life. It's, for a lot of people, it's things like inheritance and things like that. And in fact, there's a book called Inheritocracy, which has just been published in the UK, which I've just started reading. And so the once you take away the fact that I did jobs because it was how I earned the money I needed to buy slightly bigger apartment and things like that. Once you take that away, then it's all that's left is the work, and is it something you want to do? Are you doing it in the way you want to do it? Do you think you could do it differently? Do you think you could do it better? Do you think you could do it for yourself? And those are the kind of things you start to ask yourself. So in some respects, it's factors like economic factors, and also the fact that I think I mentioned in a previous episode, there was an article recently about people in their 80s who are still working full time, and to see no reason to retire because they're still well and they're still fit, and they enjoy their work. So whereas when I started in the workplace, I mean, anybody going into their 60s was like having them been pensioned off already.
Yeah.
So it was kind of it's different now, and people are working longer, and it's harder for your generation to get that kind of foothold, particularly in structured organizations, things like professional services or the creative industries. A lot of the opportunities that come in now are contracted opportunities or fractional ones. It's not full-time employment, and if we've taken away, I suppose, that structure of you'll get training, you'll work your way up, and the more you work your way up, the more you'll learn, the more you can do with your life. Start a family, buy a property, whatever. And once you take that away, then all that's left is the work. And if it's something that doesn't fulfill you, and the people you're doing it with and for don't really motivate you,
Right.
then that's why you'll find people in your generation not really caring about it.
Right. Plus, I think we grew up watching hustle culture and people burning themselves out and the economy's crashing and so it makes sense, I think, that we're skeptical. Wow, that's such a weird word to say. Of like this type of working. And I do think when going back to what you said earlier, like we ask ourselves these questions of like, could we do it differently? Could we do it for ourselves? Often I think social media plays a role in that in a big way, where it's like you see someone doing something, and I like to call it, putting it on your vision board, right? Like you see something someone's doing and you might say, "Oh, I wish that were me." Or if you're empowered and enlightened, you might say, "That will be me," or "That could be me one day." Because of this, democratization. And I think people waking up to the fact that like they have what it takes. They can, like, I think there's just this general feeling of like disempowerment, because things are hard. Like, I'm not saying that it's easy to start your own business, but I think that we've sort of been trained through the education system, and I think the Industrial Revolution was a big part of like shaping work culture and shaping education to train people to go into jobs and to work for companies for many years, many years. And the incentives were there, right? The incentives were pension and lifelong employment and health insurance, and then you could buy a home in 10 years, and there's retirement and there's 401ks, and that made a lot of sense for a lot of people for a long time. And the fact is that the economics now do not work out. And it doesn't, if you work yourself to death and you burn yourself into the ground, it actually doesn't warrant you, a house or a home or a lifelong career. And you actually could just be laid off because, head count needs to go down. And I think that people are waking up to this, and they're waking up to the fact that, building a personal brand and having what I call, brand equity of your own name is actually where we're placing more value on people. And or if you're the founder of an AI company that's going to completely disrupt the way that we do things, that's also where the value lies. And so if you're not one of those two things, it feels like, you're kind of kind of become obsolete, which is a very scary thought and a very scary thought, thought to put out there. But I do think, that's where things are trending.
Mm. No, I would agree with you. I think that your generation is a lot more experimental. I think you're a lot more creative. Whereas, I suppose, yeah, when I started work, I didn't need to be. I was pretty basic. I started off training to be an accountant. Why? Because my dad was an accountant. I
Yeah.
couldn't really think of anything else. I could at school. I wanted to be an actor. I was in drama. I was in a couple of productions. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to be an actor, but there was no real route for me to do. I could have gone to drama school, but I think the expectations on me was I'd be an accountant like my dad.
Yeah.
And it was it was like that for a lot of people that I was at school with. I mean, some didn't, but the majority of people ended up. I went to an all boys school, so it's kind of I can't say for the girls, but the yeah, people tended to be veering towards potential careers that were the same as their fathers, their uncles.
Yeah.
The family was in the family.
I'm just
Um,
curious. I'm just like, if you had deviated from that, or of your friends who deviated from what their parents did, were they labeled as something? Were they labeled as, what was that sort of,
no,
yeah,
well, they were.
understanding?
I mean,
What are they?
I did the accountancy thing, and then I walked away from it because I started doing kind of recruitment, HR, talent, because it motivated me more.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think it was a case of if you deviated away from it, if you had some success at what you were doing. I mean, not everybody did what their fathers or mothers did, um, but there was, I suppose, a perception that that's the kind of thing you would do, unless you had a very identified talent that maybe parents or family didn't have, particularly if you're right in sports or very much art, creative, that kind of space. Uh, whereas other than that, yes, it would tend to be that's what you were used to. And I suppose I'm older than you, so it was my I suppose the parental generation were ones who had come through the you've never had it so good times, the way post Second World War, the kind of boom time very much in the West. And so they were through the 60s, 70s into the 80s, there was lots happening. Um, so there were opportunities for people to do different things, but I think there was an expectation that you would probably do not the family business, but I mean you would do something that you'd been educated to do, and it probably worked. It worked for a lot of people. I mean, I ultimately found myself getting bored, which is why I went in another direction. But for a lot of people, they had very sustainable careers and built very good lives for themselves, and probably would look back and say, "I've had a great life."
Yeah.
Now, I don't think they would say, could I have had a better life if I had really, what I really wanted to do was this. I don't think you think back like that. But of course, that then brings us into the whole economic structure in particularly Europe and the US, where it's very much based on family, on work, and it's kind of people feel beholden to doing certain things and working in a certain way because that's how they're going to maintain a certain lifestyle. And it's very much uh, Gen Lay Z, because that's what it says there, who are going to change that. And I'm not just saying it because
Yeah.
I'm speaking to you. It will be, probably one of the first generations who are able to do that because the structure that older generations had is pretty much broken down now.
Hmm. Yeah, and to your point, I think it's reflected in the cultural expectations. So I sort of think about Gen Z in like two different camps. And it's definitely a simpler way to look at it. It's definitely a generalization. But I look at Gen Z as two camps, right? It's like you have the Ivy League or, top 30 school type who goes to Columbia, for example, gets their education, goes to, business school, like goes down all these paths and like really is like committed to the traditional path. Then you have of those people, obviously, some that go, well, what the heck am I doing? And kind of start to deviate from there. But then you have like this whole other camp of people who, you know, go into university and they start to question things and they're like, wait, but like, why does it work that way? And like, oh, do I really need to go work a 9 to 5? Or can I start a business right out of college? And I've met so many people in that camp who are so inspiring and who are starting to question things. And I think even if they, go into like startups, for example, like I had a friend who had a really honest conversation with their millennial older brother. And this brother said, oh, like I realized for myself that I was chasing this, you go from one job to the next and you keep earning more. But in reality, who's putting that pressure on you to do that? Right? And obviously we all want to make a lot of money and like we all want to be able to afford the lives that we want to live. But it doesn't mean that it all has to happen right now. You could be at a really stable job in a very unsexy industry and be really happy because you have a 9 to 5, you have that stability that enables you to build and to do and pursue the things that you're really passionate about. And at the same time, you could be at a nonprofit. You could be somewhere that's really impacting the world around you. And so I'm starting to see like the foot being taken off the gas and pumping the brakes of like, wait, there's more than one way to live your life. And let's start to explore what that looks like. And let's take people along with us for the journey because that is how we inspire and that's how we build, lifelong careers now because our brand is our new resume. And so thank you for letting me go on that little rant. But I think that that's like, and that's really exciting for me to see because I think I fall into that camp of like the non-traditional path and the non-linear path. And it is so rewarding. I meet so many interesting people. I get to explore these different industries and like going to an industrial intelligence conference last week. I'm like, wait, I get to explore different industries and make a living doing it. And like that is so beautiful. And I get to take people along for the ride with me. And that's the exciting part. And I think people are really energized by that kind of content. And that's, I'm excited for what the future holds with that. And I also know that like there's a lot of challenges, don't get me wrong. But I think it's important that we start to expose what that nonlinear path really looks like.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It's kind of it. If you've got, I suppose, if you've got a stable base, and that can be family, that can be anything, friends, whatever around you, then it's something you can do. Whereas I suppose there's a generation gap here. Obviously, that's the whole point of the podcast. So it was more for me. It was kind of the I didn't really have time to kind of explore what it was I wanted to do. It was kind of pretty much focused from school to college to then you start working to do what it is you've trained to do. And
Right.
so it was, I suppose years later when I started, I didn't even know, it was actually the social media era before I realized I could write.
Oh, wow.
I've now written 2 books and kind of, I didn't even know that. Because if I think back to when I was at school, it was just essays in English, and I never thought they were very good, and I never got particularly high marks. So I mean, I didn't think I could write very well.
Mhm.
But it's so even the Gen X, we've evolved as we've got older, we've evolved, and started to do different things as well. But I think that there is a kind of a self-sufficiency to a lot of Gen Z people, where they have not the confidence, but they have the wherewithal to kind of go on this path and to say, this is what I want to do, and to put themselves there. Whereas I suppose my generation was more kind of, waiting to be asked to go to an industrial intelligence conference, whereas you're pretty much putting yourself in the forefront where these people want to contact you, primarily because you have a specialization and a knowledge set that they don't really have, but they need to pass on to people.
Yeah. And I think it is, our responsibility to develop that and to, learn what people find valuable and I guess like serve, it's supply and demand. And I think like people are going to stop talking about Gen Z eventually. I'm not lost on that fact. And also I think it's more than anything, I think it's a marketing play. Because I think generations are important. It's important to understand, the macro of like, okay, what's going on in the world and how does that impact this generation? And at the same time, the things that really impact us are like, it's the combination. It's the life stuff and it's the life stage. And I think generally it doesn't really change that much in terms of what we need. Which is, support and guidance from leaders and a great culture and like meaningful work. And I think that that's the thing that I'm trying and being able to sit down and have hard conversations. And that's the thing that I actually help organizations do. Rather than like, okay, here's who Gen Z is. Of course I do that too, but it's not the most impactful work that I do. With that being said, I do want to show people this video that I referred to last week in the last episode of Gen Z and the laziness problem. So if we could roll that would be great. Last week, I went to a conference and I learned that the biggest misconception about my generation is that we're lazy. But that's actually a myth, and here's why. Last year at this same conference, there was a panel about Gen Z, but not a single person under 35 was on it. How can you talk about Gen Z without actually including us? So this year, I reached out and I made the case for why Gen Z deserves a seat at the table, and I got invited back to speak on that same panel. Here's the thing. Gen Z isn't lazy. We care about meaningful work, growth, and companies that align with our values. If we're disengaged, it's not because we don't want to work. It's actually because we don't see a future where we can thrive. So yes, young professionals need to seek out opportunities. That's our job. But companies and leaders need to invite us into the right rooms and actually give us a chance to show up and show off who we are. Thankfully, this conference, Transform, was smart enough to do just that. So no, Gen Z isn't lazy. Maybe you've just been underestimating us. What do you think? Are we lazy, or do we just know how to work smarter, not harder? Last week, I went to a conference. All right, Mervyn, any initial reactions to that video?
It sounds like Danielle. Yeah, I mean, I've obviously heard, from the chats we have on a regular basis, I've obviously heard you kind of refer to most of that. And I can see that as well from the things you do, the places you go. But yes, there is a kind of, if I think back to, I suppose, not the early days of conferences, but I mean, if I think back a few years, it was kind of only specific people who had reached specific levels in specific sectors and organizations who would be invited to talk at a conference. Whereas now it's kind of everything is much more open. And part of that is because, Gen Z, it probably started with Gen Y, but I think part of that is Gen Z because you're confident in what you know. You tend to be very educated, and you understand that, for a lot of you've got to make it yourself, and you've got to put yourselves out there and know what your core strengths are, and find a way that you can use those strengths. Whereas historically, I guess it was, if I think back to my time when I was in your situation, it would be waiting for people to come to me and say, "Oh, we could use you," or kind of, we could, yeah, you could join our organisation because we need someone like you, as opposed to we actually need someone to come in with those kind of ideas, that kind of enthusiasm, and show us where we're going wrong, or show us maybe a different way that we could do something. So it kind of, I think that the stereotype about being lazy is purely brought about, in my opinion, by I won't say, I don't want to use the word older, by a more mature generation, um,
Mm-hmm.
who believe all the kind of all the kind of anecdotes about you're always on your phone, you're always doing this, you're always doing that, and kind of, you're not really paying attention, you don't really care, and they believe all that stuff, and that's why they approach, even in the workplace, they will approach people from Gen Z on that basis. They're expecting you to kind of not want to do what they're asking you to
Yeah.
do, to kind
It's
of put up a
confirmation
fuss
bias.
about it, and yeah, um,
Yeah.
and I think that for you to go out there and to show things like that is important. But again, not everybody in Gen Z is like you.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is the kind of, I won't say entrepreneurial spirit, but that kind of spirit of there is a better way to do things, and there is a better way to utilize our skills in the workplace, and to put that out there. So it's interesting about the kind of, not caring about work.
Yeah.
I think you do care about work, but you care about work in a way that is meaningful to you.
Yeah, and I would say also involving us in the conversation is like the most low bearing fruit of like what people can do, and if you do it at a conference, it's sort of like a show of, well, we value the voice of this next generation, and they are here, they're between the ages of 13 and 28, so they're not children anymore. Half of them are adults, and more than half, and we should treat them that way. And I know I really liked this one. I liked a lot of the comments, but this one comment from last week that's still circulating. So I can't even keep up with the comments. But this one from Brandon Bendis, Gen Z isn't lazy, entitled, etc. You're simply different from generations before you, like every generation is. The best leaders know how to adapt and create environments where teams thrive. The reaction you're receiving is a defense mechanism to frustration of not identifying the right environment. I'm a millennial, and I see the new generational divide as a challenge for us older generations, not an inherent flaw in Gen Z. Our struggle to adapt to the rapidly changing landscape doesn't mean the younger generation is failing. It's unfortunately us who are struggling to keep up. I thought that was a very informed
Mm,
perspective.
yeah,
And obviously, it's not like, I want to place blame on anyone, but I do think that, and I do think that, Gen Z gets a lot of flack. Like every generation, the youngest one in the workforce gets a lot of flack. And it's like, well, why are you picking on us? Like you guys are the ones that shape the world, and we're just reacting to it. That's
yeah.
kind of how I view that.
I get that. I
Um,
get that. It's kind
yeah.
of it's evolved from the hippies when people used to turn up to work with long hair and things like that.
And smoke in
Um,
the office. Yeah.
yeah.
Just a little, just a
Yeah.
little. But yeah, I feel like that's a nice place to end for today. Thank you
Yes.
for everyone who tuned in, who got involved in the comments. Let us know what other topics and challenges you are experiencing. I'm really curious to maybe get another generation in this perspective in this convo. And also, I think this is a good, opportunity. It's a good. I think we're a good example of like what's possible. So I'll also say if you're organizing events and you're, looking for intergenerational conversations to bring to a stage, Mervyn and I are both experienced speakers and thought
Yeah.
leaders. So I'm just putting it out there. I think people need to know.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right. And if you're listening to this, watching this, and think that your organization could benefit from hearing these conversations, then conferences or we expos we do in house as well.
Yep. Don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you again for tuning into this episode of From X to Z. I'm Danielle. Mervyn and I say have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.